the Fellowship of the Ring is just such a, it's like 2 notches above, or maybe 3, above his own prose in The Hobbit.
Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Dude, it has been about 2 months since we used that intro because
so pleased.
Things went awry for us in the middle of the Rings of Power. Yeah, so we did all the Rings of Power, and it morphed into this like long every episode we did 3 chapters essentially, where we went through the 3 different primary storylines in each episode, or at least divided up into 3 parts, because if not, you would be listening to a 2.5 hour long podcast about the Rings of Power, and who really wants to do that? Actually, some of you did. And in the midst of all that, Michael moved back to the West Coast. Yep. I actually visited for 2 weeks the West Coast, so we were trying to do all this in the middle of the Rings of Power and getting everything done. And you saw in our last episode, which was 2 weeks ago, we took a break, kind of needed it to get settled, to get back into the swing of things. And we were able to record with Dan. That was a treat. That was really fun. That was
and we apologize for the quality of the recording. There was a lot of echo, but if you were us, you would have had a great time, because we had a great time recording with Dan.
That's right. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I don't know about you guys. It was really hard to listen, but boy, we had a good time after that.
Can I just say how nice it is to be back talking about actually Tolkien's works?
I know.
Not Rings of Smudge, not Peter Jackson's version of which is fine, but actually talking about Tolkien is awesome.
Yeah, and it's interesting that such a negative, such a sadly, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. My reaction to the Rings of Power is like this love-hate relationship. I love to talk with you guys about it, but man, I hate watching it and prepping for it. Like, you guys saw our notes. I don't know if you saw. Like, I use an iPad to do it, and I took pages of notes on there. Michael does it by hand, and his looks really daunting. But we're sitting there watching the Rings of Power, taking notes on stuff that's not even Tolkien in the end. And now we get to actually spend like an entire episode on just a half chapter of The Hobbit, and it's a wonderful thing. We get to dive into the details. What originally made us love The Lord of the Rings.
And there will be a very mild reference to Rings of Power, not directly, but because in this beautiful book that you sprung for me. Whoops!
Right here, there. This one.
Oh, it's a green book. That's right. So it sees it as a green screen. There you go. There we go. Wrong color green. So anyway, in this version, there was a cool little footnote about one of the illustrators, a Japanese illustrator.
No. Well, save it, because we have to talk about. We have to talk a little bit about the stuff that's not Tolkien again in Lord of the Rings for the new movie that was announced.
Oh yes, well,
the hunt for Gollum. But before I get into that, hey, I do want to shout out our supporters who are still sticking with us despite taking 2 weeks off, despite going through the Rings of Power for a month and a half. Thanks to Lynn and Rich, guys. We appreciate you, and all of our other subscribers. I mean, the appreciation that we have in order to keep this going, and we're going to have to switch from StreamYard, obviously. Like the cost of this year, it keeps us running, keeps the hosting going, and we'll hopefully buy a green screen for Michael at some point.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna get my my visuals fixed in the next couple of weeks, but still,
you can become a podcast member at the One Ring. Podcast member, is that what we call it? You can become a member, theonering.com/member. You get access to our Discord chat. You get access to the extended podcast where this week we're going to talk about coincidences in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, but mostly The Hobbit, and see at what point does providence get overwhelmed by coincidence. I think is maybe the best way to put it.
It's actually been my favorite phrase from literature over the last 2 years, is year and a half, has been chance, if chance you call it. It's the whole
chance you call it.
I love it. It's Tolkien's way of bringing in the hand of providence in the most English way possible, which is we're not going to say it's the hand of God. but we're not going to say it's the hand of God.
So we're gonna keep dancing around. Just gonna be keeping circumspect, but hinting at the truth that lies within. So yeah, become a member, theonering.com/member or theonering.com/Patreon, and you get the first month free. Patreon, it's the first week free because they don't even offer the first month. So if they did, I would, but I can't. So sorry.
Patreon's getting cheap, huh?
Yeah. Well, what's not getting cheap, man. I don't know if this was a good segue here, but we have The Hunt for Gollum coming out. Year? No, it's probably gonna be 2 years from now. And they recently had some sort of showcase that I wasn't invited to because Hollywood hates us now, Michael, because we're keep their feet to the fire. But
we have the right enemies.
Yeah. We they had an announcement for the War of the Rohirrim, some sort of, I don't know, I don't even follow it because I don't really care about the War of the Rohirrim. It doesn't really get me at all. I don't know. I'm not looking forward to it at all. However,
the War of the Rohirrim, you mean?
Oh my gosh, yes. But they did talk about The Hunt for Gollum and how it won't be 2 films anymore. It will be 1 film, thankfully, because remember, The Hunt for Gollum is like a 2.5 paragraphs from the Council of from the Council of Elrond in Fellowship of the Ring.
Right.
But here's what she said. She said, it's quite an intense story, which falls after the birthday party of Bilbo and before the Mines of Moria. It's a specific chunk of incredible untold story. Okay, by she, I meant Felba Boynes. Her daughter's a screenwriter, and she's a producer on this here, I think. It's going to be told through the perspective of this incredible creature.
Yeah, well, this incredible creature had a whole game made after him. You see, he was so incredible that they made a video game. It went about as well as you'd expect. Most
perfectly horrible game of 2023. Actually, it killed the studio Daedalic that made it. So I hope this was a misspoken statement here, but it's going to be told through the perspective of Gollum. I don't think is anything anybody actually wants. So let's not go there, Philippa.
Yeah, I find this to be highly corporate. I mean, here's the thing: when I saw Peter Jackson's Rings of Power, I was very, especially as the story goes on through the 3 movies, I was very impressed with Gollum. Like what they did, how they did Gollum. I really liked Gollum. I thought they did a great job, and even his inner dialogues, everything about almost everything about Gollum, I loved. I thought it was perfectly done according to Tolkien, and it is a hallmark of the corporate world, especially in movie making and TV making, that if a thing works and is good, the suits, and I'm speaking as somebody who is a suit of a type inside, and I've worked in the corporate world for a quarter century, almost a quarter century. The suits would like their idea is, well, this made money, so this was good, and the good thing made money, so we should do more of that same thing, and that will make us more money. And it turns out that with certain characters like Gollum, you can have the right amount, and it can be awesome, and then you're done. And if you're not done, and you decide to make whole games or whole movies based on him, you are indeed stabbing yourself in the foot. I think this is doomed.
Yeah, I do too. And plus, it's again, they stretched out The Hobbit over 3 films. They're going to stretch out 2 paragraphs over an entire film at this point. And it's going to be Aragorn's supposed to be younger. I mean, not a ton younger, but younger. Gandalf's supposed to be the same at least. But I mean, Ian McKellen's 84, 85, and Viggo Mortensen's I think in his early 60s at this point. So yeah, he's in his 60s now. So they're going to have to de-age. They're going to have to do something. And nobody cares. We know how the story ends. This is the problem again, that we know how this story specifically ends.
Exactly. Everyone knows there's no mystery to this. There's nothing. There's going to be the intense, like, the good guys are employing a kind of torture, and the bad guys are employing a kind of torture, because we get to see Sauron apparently, torture Gollum. And then we get to watch Gollum run around for forever. I'm just
looking forward to the part where he bites Aragorn. That's going to be the highlight. One thing we learned.
This is a cash grab.
That is literally what he says. He bit him. That's what I think. Aragorn said all he got from his mouth was a bite or something along those lines, right? All he got from Gollum was a bite mark, nothing else out of his mouth. So anyway,
hopes aren't high for this.
Yeah. So anyway, we've got that coming, and then we've also got the War of the Rohirrim coming later. All right. So we are going to jump into the second half of chapter 3 of The Hobbit. But before we do, every time we have an episode where we review The Hobbit, we have to have our
Hobbit Facts.
All right. So some of you, I'm sure, have seen this image of the bird, the eagle that Tolkien drew. And you can see Bilbo right here next to him, right? This is after they were picked up from being attacked by the wargs after leaving Moria, and the eagles come and save them. So, yeah. So what's interesting here is Christopher Tolkien revealed that it was, I think it was in a talk he gave at one point, that it was based on a painting by a Scottish ornithological artist named Archibald Thorburn of an immature golden eagle. Eventually, Christopher Tolkien found this image because his dad told him what it was. And it was in the 1919 book, The Birds of the British Isles and Their Eggs. And so here's the original picture. You can see that.
Cool.
And here's Tolkien. So he copied right here. I mean, it's about as perfectly copied as you can get. So there's the eagle. The eagles of Manwë are actually immature golden eagles.
I remember seeing the picture when I was a kid and thinking that was cool that they're based on golden eagles.
Yeah, you knew what a golden eagle was when you were a kid?
My father was a falconer, so yes.
Oh, I just wish he would have put something dead in its talons like he has in this picture right here too.
Well, there is something almost dead.
Right there.
Kind of like deadish.
Yeah, so I'll put links to these here in the show notes for you guys who are listening, so that you can see these photos. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting little
very good,
fact.
cool catch.
Okay, so let's jump into the second half of chapter 3 of The Hobbit. This is where Bilbo, the dwarves, and Gandalf have arrived at Rivendell. The silly, mischievous, not tricky, troublesome elves were around them. They're the ones singing at them. The tricksy elves, the elves that seemed more like the elves from the Father Christmas letters than they do from the elves from the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion.
Yes, and I hold to the idea that there is a shift.
There is a shift, and that shift begins with this. Okay, to me, this was a little bit of a tortured phrase. The second half that started it, and I had to read it a few times to really truly understand it. So I'm going to read it here. And we can talk about it a little bit. And he says this: "Now it is a strange thing, but things that are good to have and days that are good to spend are soon told about and not much to listen to, while things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome may make a good tale and take a deal of telling anyway." It's sort of like saying nobody likes a happy story. Everybody just wants the gruesome details. Nobody wants to hear about what went right. We just want to hear about what went wrong. And so I had to read that a couple times. Like, what is days that are good to spend are soon told about. Okay. And not much to listen. Oh, okay. They're told about, I had a great time, but nobody really cares. And so you said, Michael, this seems very English, the way he phrased
it. It does. Well, so the English have a habit sometimes in their literature of turning a sentence into a kind of edifice, like building it into a building. And, this is a small version of this, but it was they enjoy the use of clauses and phrases to basically pack what is essentially 2 or 3 sentences into a single sentence, which is why it comes across as rather torturous sometimes. The funniest example, apropos of nothing, but because I have lots of children, so I guess apropos of that, and The Hobbit is a children's tale, so one of the authors I love the best, if children's literature, is A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh, and the original Winnie the Pooh, not the Disney Winnie the Pooh. But there is A.A. Milne does this great. I mean, he writes pure children's stories, but he does it in a way which makes even adults laugh. And there's this sentence from one of his stories, which is in which Piglet is entirely surrounded by water. And there's a flood. and Piglet has to be rescued. He's up on a branch, and at the end of this story, Winnie the Pooh comes and Christopher Robin come to rescue him, and A.A. Milne writes a sentence that is like the Platonic form of the kind of sentence that you just read from Tolkien. It's hilariously long, and it's so long that A.A. Milne is playing a joke on us and even references it in the sentence. And the sentence goes like this. In after years, okay, the previous sentence was, you can imagine Piglet's joy when at last the ship came in sight of him. And here's the sentence. In after years, he liked to think that he had been in very great danger during the terrible flood, but the only danger he had really been in was the last half hour of his imprisonment, when Owl, who had just flown up, sat on a branch of his tree to comfort him and told him a very long story about an ant who had once laid a seagull's egg by mistake. And the story went on and on, rather like this sentence, until Piglet, who was listening out of his window without much hope, went to sleep quietly and naturally, slipping slowly out of the window towards the water until he was only hanging on by his toes, at which moment, luckily, a loud squawk from Owl, which was really a part of the story, being what his aunt said, woke the Piglet up and just gave him time to jerk himself back into safety and say, "How interesting, and did she?" When, well, you can imagine his joy when at last he saw the good ship, Brain of Pooh, coming over the sea to rescue him.
That's one sentence.
That's one sentence. And it's an extreme version of this, but this is the kind of thing where every once in a while the English slip into these sentences where they're just kind of proving what they can do with the word language, and so they just write these sentences that are quite long. And so this was a very Tolkien's version, very small version of that. Tolkien has a couple of those over this story and the Lord of the Rings, where he writes these very long sentences with lots of clauses. So clearly he didn't grow up in America with my 6th grade English teacher who would have slashed and burned it all. But anyway,
it's the exact opposite of Cormac McCarthy.
Yes, exactly right.
Who hates anything that is superfluous, and so he doesn't do capitalizations. He doesn't ever do semicolons. He hates commas, quotes. He doesn't put any quotes in his writing. It's a little difficult to read sometimes. It's sort of like I'm making up my own rules, and I find it a little off-putting, honestly. But
the road is a great book.
The Road, what was the one I just read? The cowboy one. It was called Blood Meridian. That's the one.
Well, Blood Meridian. Oh.
And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it because I like westerns and it was kind of brutal. But yeah, the reading it is very difficult. Whereas this is the exact opposite end, where you keep going and going and going with these long sentences that have semicolons, that have commas, that have quotes, that might have a dash even, and it's the exact opposite of that. So yeah, I appreciate it though. It's at this point that they enter the House of Elrond. And if you remember in The Lord of the Rings, the House of Elrond was the last homely house, I believe. Right. Isn't that? Yeah.
Yes. The last homely house.
And the different phrases that he ends up using for this here, it's sort of like, and I think maybe this is the point at which we go into this. This is where he injects, like we learned last episode, 2 months ago, that Elrond was a fortunate accident, that he needed a name, and Elrond was the name he came up with for this character in this place called Rivendell. But those names have history and meaning, and Tolkien can't simply just abandon all that. So it's at this point where it just kind of, it explodes out. And so he talks about Gondolin, and he talks about the names of the swords. And it feels more like Middle-earth, but sort of like Cliff Notes Middle-earth a little bit. Whereas in the Council of Elrond, we get the entire history of everything, so to speak. Here we get a brief history of a few things.
Right.
And I found that much more charming, much more enjoyable at this point. I think like this is where the story starts in a way. I guess that's where the story starts in the Lord of the Rings too, almost the real tale to tell.
Right. Yet I had a modified take on that when I was rereading this time. I was realizing, because we're doing the slow read of The Hobbit, that this was the first time that Tolkien really digs in to the history of his world. in a chapter, and it's not even a chapter, it's the second half of this third chapter. So before there were some references, Thorin tells the tale of the fall of Erebor to Smaug, and there are a handful of other little references. But in this second half of the chapter, Tolkien really digs in to the history of his world, and it starts to feel less like a children's tale and more like you're actually in Middle Earth. So he says he does it in a bunch of ways. So he starts with, the master of the house was an elf friend, one of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginning of history, the war of the evil goblins and the elves and the first men in the north. I mean, this is straight from the Silmarillion. In those days of our tale, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors, and Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. So he really sort of digs into that. And there's something else I'm going to say about his description of Elrond, which I think is cool, because he really parallels himself in both this book and in the Fellowship of the Ring, because he gives a description of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring too. So it was fascinating. Like, it's almost like Rivendell's this stopping point for you to take a deep breath and then see the background of Tolkien's world. Remember in the Hall of Fire in the Fellowship of the Ring, that's when they're given the tale of Earendil, and Elrond is first described, and Gandalf is there. And even though Gandalf's been there before, all of a sudden Frodo's seen him with new eyes, and all of a sudden it's like you're in an epic. Once you reach Rivendell, everything you're now in an epic story. It's not just a hobbits trying to survive story, which is the two tales there.
And I think, if I can interject here, when he describes Rivendell in The Hobbit, it is brief and it uses very specific language. Specific in the sense that it doesn't create a world for you inside your own. It isn't sub-creative as much as, say, The Lord of the Rings. And here's the quote I'm going to use for this. He talks about Rivendell and what it was like to be in Rivendell here in The Hobbit. He says, his house was perfect, whether you liked food or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. And whenever I can bring up my favorite lines of prose from The Lord of the Rings, I can. And this is how he describes then what it was like to be in the Hall of Fire, the same place essentially, right, Rivendell, and how it affected Frodo. This is from the Many Meetings chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring. Almost it seemed that the words took shape and visions of far lands and bright things that he'd never yet imagined opened out before him. And the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike until he felt that an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, too multitudinous for its pattern to be comprehended. It became part of the throbbing air around him, and it drenched and drowned him. Swiftly he sank under its shining weight into a deep realm of sleep. And so whereas here in The Hobbit, he says, it was perfect, whether you liked food or sleep or work. And here Tolkien creates this sense of being swallowed up in the most comfortable, in the most rich, in the most emotionally satisfying way, where you are, where you're following on an endless river of swelling gold and silver flowing over you. And I don't know, like it's creating, you are subcreating, because when you say it's perfect, whether you like to food, sleep, or work, it's very general. But there's specific words, right? But it's very general. Like you can say, oh, I can believe that. But when you create these visual images of what that feels like, it's different for everybody, but it's much more personal. It's much more how you would feel when you are being swallowed by an endless swelling of gold and silver flowing over you. So anyway, that's where, like, I think he became such a better writer in The Lord of the Rings from this point. He had spent almost
it's so true. He honed his craft. So yeah. I love what you said there. I love too that in the Hall of Fire, I never thought about it this way. The elves are subcreating. That was great. That was a good catch there, because they're telling a tale, and the way elves tell tales, it creates this all immersive experience that draws you in. And I mean, that's the definition of subcreation on fairy stories. And so the elves are subcreating, and they're the masters of subcreation when it comes to telling tales. I'm going to compare. It's not as good as the one you read, but I'm going to compare his growth in the way he described Elrond in The Hobbit versus the Fellowship of the Ring. So he does in The Hobbit, he gives a description of Elrond. He says, he was as noble and fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. In the original manuscript, it was as kind as Christmas.
I marked that down too. I'm like, oh, he's like, no, got rid of that. Sorry, guys.
A little too specific. Okay, as kind as summer. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure is only a small one, though important, you will see if we ever get to the end of it. So that's his description of Elrond there. In the Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship of the Ring, his prose has come to the next level, has gotten to the next level. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things, both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were as gray as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Venerable he seemed, as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was the Lord of Rivendell, and mighty among both elves and men. So it's almost a completely different register. One is, it's describing, in some ways, there's parallels, right? You know, it talks about him being both a warrior and wise and a king. And
the word venerable is used in both.
Exactly. Some of the same words are used. But the Fellowship of the Ring is just it's like 2 notches above, or maybe 3, above his own prose in The Hobbit. And that's what that's why I know we often reference this, but I really think it's true that The Hobbit is a different kind of book. It's connected, Tolkien made sure they were connected in the same world, but it's a different kind of book from different kind of story from the Lord of the Rings.
So you said that, right? I love that you brought that up. I think that's almost an even more direct connection between the two books, because of like the wordage is almost the same. He says warrior, he says venerable, but he had created the world so much more at that point, and so he knew exactly what it is he wanted to say, and he could say it so much better because he'd practiced so much more. And now I lost my train of thought as I dived into that that little side. Oh, you were saying, so the history, right? This is where the history of Elrond comes in, and of Rivendell comes in, because he becomes, what is it, Turgon's great-grandson, I believe, right? Yeah. And so
maybe 2 greats, actually.
His father is Arundel, and then Idril, and then Turgon. So 2. So great.
Okay, great-grandson.
Great-grandson. So because of that, now we learn about the swords. The swords already have names. And so he brings in, because he used Elrond, and they're like, okay, now I'm going to have to use Glamdring, because that was Turgon's sword. Although I think at this point, Elrond wasn't necessarily Turgon's great-grandson.
Oh no, he definitely wasn't. Yeah. But it's a progression. Tolkien is unfolding the history of his world. First, he tells us that Elrond was from the time of where there were goblins and elves in the first men of the north, and he's one of the descendants. Then he goes into this description of Elrond. He kind of begins to inflate him, in a good way. I don't mean in a bad way. Yeah. And then Elrond shows his knowledge of the swords, and runes. But it isn't just him showing the knowledge of runes. He then brings in Gondolin, like you said. He's talking about a very specific place. But it's pretty clear. It would have been the perfect place for us to tie his own heritage. Like he's talking about Gondolin, right? Yeah. His great grandfather's city. And so, if Tolkien had been certain that was where what he was going to be from and his particular background, that would have been the time he would have made an offhanded reference, like he does. But he does make that reference. He then brings up the fact that these trolls didn't take these weapons. They were in some horde. I mean, they took them from a horde somewhere. They weren't the ones that took them off of their original owners or anything. and he brings up the dragons, and then he references how sad he was at the fall of Dale. So you see Elrond's memory is long, and and so there's a whole in a matter of a page and a half, Tolkien unfolds all these aspects of the ancient history of his world to the reader in a way that he hasn't done before. He did one glimpse with which is the fall of Erebor from Thorin, but then here we're tied into all these concepts that Tolkien hasn't touched on before, and which increase the richness of his world and give it a history which is only hinted at. And like all the best imaginative works, he doesn't spell everything out. He just gives you hints.
It's interesting then that though the history was shifting, and this is that inflection point where, like you're saying, it changes, that there are so many coincidences that still have to occur. And this last half chapter is kind of rife with the most almost unbelievable coincidences that are necessary in order for the story to take place. The first being, of course, that they got these swords, and they got it because Gandalf or Frodo just happened to find the key, and then they just happened to find the orc horde, and then they just happened to find the two swords in there.
Yeah.
And now Gandalf has the map that he's had for a long time, and they just happen to be there on the day that the map can be read by a guy who just happens to know that it can be read on that particular day. And so we've got the moon runes that are found when the moon, let's see, it's I'm trying to find the moon in a broad silver crescent, right? He held up the map, and the white light shone through it. "What is this?" he said. "There are moon letters here beside the plain runes, which say 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast." "What are moon letters?" asked the hobbit. "Moon letters are rune letters, but you cannot see them. Not when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them. And what is more, with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon of the same shape and season as the day when they were written." So they just happened to give it to him on the right day in order to read it right there. And not that that's a bad thing, but boy, that's a coincidence. And then the moon letters tell them that they have to essentially open the door on a specific day of the specific year and specific month in order to actually get into the mountain to have the back door that's opened. So a lot of coincidence here.
Chance. If
Providence,
chance you call it. Chance, if chance you call it. It's my favorite. One of my favorite lines from Gandalf. I think Tolkien is, if not leaning into it, at least fine with it. Fine with coincidence. However, one of the interesting things I did find, speaking of the coincidence subject, was when you go back to the 1937 script of The Hobbit, the original one, there's an even more unlikely chance that Tolkien thought was so preposterous that he removed it from the later 1966 version, and that was that in this conversation, Gandalf, or Bloodorthan at this point. Gandalf is Thorin, and Bloodorthan is Gandalf.
Yeah, so you mean like the 1930 version, essentially, like the really early version?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. The really early version.
From the history of the Hobbit book that goes through.
Bloodorthan, Gandalf, shows the Elrond the ring, the key ring from the trolls that opened up all their stuff, and in the middle of the key ring is the key for the dwarf door of Durin.
That's geez, I didn't realize that. I missed that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Gandalf and Elrond's like, you might want to keep that for later. And Gandalf takes it off the ring and puts it on a chain around his neck. And so
so he's dialing it back, actually.
Yeah, he actually dialed back the coincidence. and he gave the ring, he gave the key to Thorin around his neck in the published version. So anyway, it's so he dials back the coincidence a little bit, but you're right. It's rife with coincidence and unlikeliness, and I find that to be both perfect for a children's story, because that's one of those things that children delight in. They delight in things that just happen to be just so and work out perfectly, and it's just exactly the right thing for exactly the right moment. Yeah, and there's a kind of childlike delight in that, and so there's quite a bit of that in fairy stories.
Yeah,
and so I find that to be okay here, and I also find it to be somewhat fine. Well, anyway, we'll hold my final thought for our later
because I
discussion.
have some certain thoughts about the coincidences too, which we'll
Cool.
get to in our extended podcast.
So y'all need to join our members club.
Bam, thewandering.com/member. See it real fast. I'll take it away now. So yeah, okay. I have a big thought about that. But I'm going to hold it because why coincidences actually, like there are coincidences like that drive a story forward because the writer wrote themselves into a corner and has to have something happen. So people who would never normally meet in the middle of a large city end up walking by each other and accidentally knocking into each other. And the guy says something like Martha, and he said, "Oh, that's my mother's name too." So I don't know if you get that's from the Batman v Superman movie, which didn't make any sense, but it's a sort of like, well, why? That's not coincidence. Like, doesn't really happen. But there's an important part of coincidences, which I will bring up in our extended podcast. All right. So this chapter ends with Elrond telling him that they have to stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. So they know what they need to do. They know the day they need to get there. And that's pretty much it. They're ready to go.
I have two thoughts about this last part of the chapter. One thing that I never noticed, and one thing that I think is a kind of a, I mean, I don't call it a mistake, but it's definitely shows an evolution of Elrond. Okay. Elrond. So the evolution of Elrond is, this Elrond is not quite at the level. The Elrond of the Fellowship of the Ring goes to 11, and this one does not. And by that I mean, this is from Elrond, referencing the words that you just mentioned. Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks, read Elrond, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Durin, said Thorin. He was the father of the fathers of the eldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I am his heir. By the way, that's yet another reference to the history of Middle-earth that Tolkien's bringing in, this time not from the mouth of Elrond, but from the mouth of Thorin. And so that's cool. And then Elrond says, then what is Durin's day? Okay, this is Elrond, the lore master of the wise. He knows who Durin is, and he's known the dwarves for thousands of years. He knows what Durin's day is, but he asks the question. He would know what Durin's day is. Yeah, because Thorin even kind of answers him sort of dismissively. He says, the first day of the dwarves' New Year, said Thorin, is, as all should know, the first day of the last moon of the autumn on the threshold of winter. It's just,
duh.
It's duh. Which to us, that's funny because of course we have no way of knowing it. But Elrond literally has been interacting with dwarves for thousands of years, so there's no way that he doesn't know what Durin's day is. But anyway,
when you think of it, it's sort of like saying it's Christmas. Because Durin is like the old lead, right? He is the dwarf, the dwarf. He's the one leading there. So it's like, dude, you don't know what day Christmas is? Even everybody knows what day Christmas is. Doesn't matter what you believe. Yeah, same sort of idea.
I like that. That's good. And the last thing that I never read, it happens every time that I read Tolkien again, no matter how many times I read him, I notice things I've never noticed before. And this is from Gandalf. That remains to be seen, said Gandalf. Is there any more writing? None to be seen by this moon, said Elrond, and he gave the map back to Thorin, and they went down to the water to see the elves dance and sing upon the Midsummer's Eve. So, like, it actually reminds me of like a dad, like just snapping the book shut. The kids are like, nope, what about more? Nope, not tonight. but so he has dad. He's giving me dad vibes with that line. But that wasn't what I was going to bring up. What I was going to bring up was his line, none to be seen by this moon. And then there's a picture of the map. And I thought that was really cool because I'd never noticed it before, because I never thought about it. Like, there could be other moon letters written by the light of different moons on this map. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the picture of the map, and I'm going to let you hold it up if you can, or put it up because it's going to green screen me out of existence.
I'll get it in a sec
if I try to. But there's the moon letters with a hand on them. Or actually, the moon letters might be the moon letters are the hand, next to the hand, and then
trying to find a quality version of it here. Hang on.
Oh, maybe it's the letters underneath the Desolation of Smaug. But anyway, I looked at the map again. I thought actually it's pretty cool because there are definitely like 2 other spots, or maybe 3 or 4, where you could have more moon letters written. It looks like the dwarves who made the map, they kind of like filling out all the spaces. but then there's 3 prominent spaces that have nothing in them. And there's the space above the finger. There we go. Space above the finger, the space below the finger. And then the moon letters are actually under the first moon letters are under the Desolation of Smaug title there. If you look in the middle, yep, right there. That's where the moon letters actually are. The moon letters they can read. But I'm noticing that there's 3 other spaces that they're and right the dwarves tend to. It looks like they like filling out their map. They don't like blank spaces. So the fact there's 3 blank spaces and Elrond says none to be seen by this moon means that, to me, there might be other moon letters written in these other spaces, which is just one of those really cool sort of Tolkien fires the imagination sort of lines that he then goes on and never addresses again. But I think it's pretty cool.
I was just looking at this map. I've never looked at it thinking about that. Reminds me a little bit of the style of Father Christmas letters, the way he writes this. If you it's the style. Okay, this is kind of a weird thing, but look at how he does a little a little squiggle on every single H, D, L, and I think that's it. Yeah, H, D's, and L's, same squiggle. They have it, and it's good. It adds style.
It's when the long bar would come, the stem would come up. He does it. He turns it into a squiggle.
Right there, old. Yeah, and it adds this sort of like I don't know the style to this here that's different than everything else too. So anyway, you can look at it like here lies Greenwood.
Does it look thin and spider? Does his writing look thin and spidery like
it has
his own?
It has a but a little bit of that, but not quite. Anyway, yeah, I love that. This is just think like everybody has to do a map now when they do a fantasy book, and they don't think it through, and they don't actually have writing, and they don't actually it's just right. It's just second.
They just make up random words.
Yeah, and this there's so much meaning to all this here. Anyway, cool. Yeah, that stuck out to me too. That that there could be other words on here. Don't know. You want to stick around for another year, and we'll find out every night of the year if the moon is
or I've got a better idea. Let's go watch the elves dance.
That's right.
So down they went.
So all right, guys, that's the end of chapter 3 of The Hobbit. Woo! It's good to be back. Next week we're actually going to be doing the last rewritten portion of The Hobbit that Tolkien attempted to rewrite and publish and gave up after part of chapter 3. So we're going to talk about that. There's not a whole lot to it, but I think there's enough to talk about. So we're going to concentrate on that next week. You can find that in The History of the Hobbit, which is a pretty good book if you really want to spend 1,000 pages going through The Hobbit like we are.
Yeah, it's pretty. Oh no!
No, there it is. There.
Oh, whatever.
It's all disappearing. If you're listening to this, Michael's trying to hold it up, and it's halfway not there.
Oh, I gotta fix my background.
Green screen. So we'll jump into that again. If you want to hear the extended edition, where we're going to talk about coincidence in The Hobbit and why it's kind of important or why it's maybe over the top. Go to theoneway.com/member, become a member. Get that there. You can ask questions in Discord too. And we'll see you guys next week.
Adios, freeloaders.